Being an author, and especially a self-published author, is not for the faint of heart. Before I get into all of the details, I want you to remember one thing. Publishing is basically gambling. Deciding to publish a book is no different from taking your money, walking into a casino, and sitting down at the blackjack table. You could win big, or you could lose everything you bet. There's an element of skill, sure, but there's a whole lot of luck involved as well. That's why the entire publishing game is all about minimizing your risk. There are so many people posting in the self-publishing online communities who are getting super confused and frustrated with the whole process. Don't get me wrong, there are some things that we really should be very frustrated about as self-published authors. However, there are a lot of headaches and frustration that you can save yourself if you just take a little bit of time to understand the business model for publishers and how the whole publishing industry works. I'm going to break it all down in this video. Who's involved, where the money comes from, where the money all goes, and how you should be spending your time and money. The first thing you need to understand is the supply chain. A supply chain is the whole chain of people involved in supplying a product or service to the end customer. In our case, books. Supply chains are like a river. Products flow down the supply chain and money flows back up. There's a basic business model which talks about each link in the supply chain providing some value add to the one before it. And that value should be reflected in the final price that is paid by the end consumer. Now, let's put in all the cash flows and see where the money comes from and where it all goes. Readers buy books and pay money to retailers, who buy wholesale from distributors, who get books shipped to them from printers, who are paid by the publishers. The distributors take their cut off the top of that and pass the money through to the publishers. The publishers then have to pay everybody else that was involved in the production of that book. Usually everybody involved works for hire except for the author, who gets royalties. Essentially, royalties are a form of profit sharing arrangement. When we're talking figures in publishing, everything is expressed as a percentage of the recommended retail price, or the RRP of that book. So let's take a look at a hardcover book with an RRP of $25. Where does that $25 go? Most people think that the breakdown looks something like this. Now, you might think this is unfair, you might think that the publisher is ripping you off, you might think that your share of the royalties as an author should be higher. I mean, you wrote the book, right? Like, it wouldn't exist without you. Okay, whatever, we're not here to debate that in this video. There's a lot of other nuanced perspectives that have already been shared on this topic, so I will put those links in the description so you can check those out. Here's how I really want you to think about that split of the RRP. It actually looks more like this. Retailers make money off of the price differential between what they sell your book for and what they buy the book for. Here's the risk for retailers, right? They only make money if they can sell your book. Every time a customer walks out of that store without the book that they want to buy, that's lost sales and lost profits for the retailer. Retailers basically have to guess at what books are going to sell and try to keep as much of those in stock as possible, because if you walk into a store and they don't have the book that you want, chances are you're not going to come back into that particular store. But the problem with this is trying to buy every single book that's published out there and having one copy on the shelf at every single store is going to tie up a lot of that retailer's money in all of this inventory. And there's just not enough space on the bookshelves or even in the warehouses for all of that. Retailers try to minimize their risk by only holding on to books that they think they're going to be able to sell and being able to return any books that don't sell back to the publisher. And that's why if you're a self-published author and you're wondering why your book is not on the shelves at your local bookstore or at Barnes & Noble or wherever, you need to check whether you're, one, giving enough discounts, and two, whether you're allowing returns. The industry default for a retailer's discount ranges somewhere between 40 and 50% off the RRP. Now, whether or not you should actually do that is a topic for a different video. Ebook retailers work a little bit differently to physical bookstores in that they take what's called a commission instead of a discount, but it basically works out to be the same. And the typical commission that they take ranges from like 30 to 40% and sometimes a little bit higher depending on how you set your pricing levels. Distributors are another type of middleman. They're a logistics provider. Essentially, what they do is move books around. Their cut typically is between 10 to 15%, and this applies both to physical book distributors as well as ebook distributors. This sounds pretty unfair until you think about all of the headaches and the million and one tasks involved in trying to ship books to people. I only shipped like 10 copies for beta readers and reviewers to have a look at, and just trying to ship those 10 to make sure that they all got to where they were supposed to go at a reasonable cost and got there on time. That was a headache that I did not like dealing with, and I would happily pay somebody 10 to 15% to just deal with all of that for me. Now, onto the printers. You can either do print on demand, which is primarily what most self-published authors will do, or you can do what's known as offset printing. So in terms of the percentage of our RRP, it gets a little weird here depending on which service that you go with. The difference between these two methods is basically in the number of print books that you're going to do in a single print run. With offset printing, we're talking hundreds, if not thousands of books. Whereas print on demand, which should more accurately be termed print in really, really small batches, deals with print runs that are 100 books or less. Printing is one of those things where you get massive economies of scale. It takes the same amount of time and cost to set up regardless of how many copies you print. You don't do less setup just because you have to print one book versus printing a million books. You still have to set up all of the printing presses, all of the design files, all of the checks, all of the proofing. You have to do all of that. When you take all of the costs for that setup and divide it by the number of copies in the print run, it becomes obvious that it's going to be a lot cheaper to do a million books versus doing one book. But let's say $2 or $3, or maybe even less if you are doing offset printing in the thousands. Versus print on demand, it costs somewhere between $7 to $15, which is what it cost me for my book. After the retailer's discount or commission, the distributor's cut, and the printing cost, you're left with maybe 30% or less of the RRP that the publisher then has to use to cover all of the remaining production costs of the book, like editing, illustrations, cover art, cover design, typesetting, marketing, and of course, author royalties. We'll talk more about royalties in a different video because it can get very, very complicated, but as an author, when you sign a publishing contract in most cases, you get an advance on the future royalties that you're going to earn on your book. That is not free money. Advances are all about shifting the timing of the cash flows. Instead of getting paid your royalties when your book is published and starts selling, you're getting them up front. The publisher is saying, here, have a couple of $1,000s to pay your bills or whatever as you write the book. And in the future, if and when we publish your book, any royalties that you earn on those sales, we're going to apply that to your advance. Think of it as a payday loan. That said, advances work a little bit differently to payday loans in that if you do everything on your end of the contract as an author, that is, you deliver a final manuscript that is fit for publication, then you don't actually need to repay that advance if the publisher decides for whatever reason that they're not going to publish that book. And even if they do publish the book and your book doesn't sell as many copies as they think it will and you never earn out that advance, you still don't need to pay it back. So when you consider the whole picture, that royalty split up front, which looked pretty unfair, actually starts to make a lot of sense. It's the publisher who's going to be left holding the bag if they can't sell those books. In the publisher-author relationship, the publisher is the one who takes the risk if the book doesn't do as well as they hoped, and that's reflected in the royalty split. Because the publishing game is all about getting books written by authors into the hands of people who like to read those books, the total amount of money for the supply chain can be summed up in a very simple formula. The number of copies sold times RRP. The recommended retail price is set by the publisher, but they don't have as much control over it as you would think. That's because, like any other product or service, you can draw a supply and demand curve for books. And because books have been around for a really long time, these supply and demand curves have settled into a sort of equilibrium. Now, if you think about this as a reader, you're probably going to already have a certain expectation as to how much a book should cost. That means, for all intents and purposes, nobody in the supply chain can really do too much to increase the recommended retail price. Readers are not going to buy them if you set it too high, and if you set it too low, nobody in the supply chain is going to recoup their investment. So, the million-dollar question is, and it literally is a million-dollar question because this is how acquiring editors at publishing houses try to figure out how much of an advance to give an author. How many copies of that book are going to sell? I could do a whole nother video on all of the data and modeling that goes into figuring out the lifetime sales of a book, but it basically boils down to intuition and guesswork. What you need to know is that the fundamental assumption underlying all of these models is that a reader's past purchasing behavior and reading preferences are going to be highly predictive of their future purchasing behaviors and reading preferences. As with any type of modeling, the more specific you can get, so in other words, the more disaggregated you can make your data, the more likely it is that your predictions are going to be more accurate. That's why the market for books is segmented into all of these genres, and then each genre also has subgenres or specific niches within it. Because the more specific you can get with your marketing, the more likely it is that you're going to find readers who are going to love that book. That's why there's such a huge emphasis in knowing what your comparables are, your comparable authors and the comparable titles on the market that have done well. Making these estimates is more of an art than a science, and publishers still get this wrong all the time. Publishers will still end up with flops that they thought were going to be total winners and have blockbusters come out of basically nowhere. Most traditionally published authors are never actually going to earn out that advance. That is to say, publishers are losing money on most of the books that they publish. And that is why publishing is basically gambling. The entire business model for traditional publishers is to sit at the blackjack table hoping to win big on a couple of hands in order to cover off all of their other losses, pay the bills, and make a living. Yeah, it's risky. So, if you've decided to self-publish, then congratulations! Not only are you an author, you are also a gambler. I mean, you are the sole person in charge of the success of your book as the publisher, the one who is ultimately responsible for whether your book is commercially successful and whether you recoup your investment on that book. No pressure, right? So what does all this mean in terms of how you should spend your money and time? Well, my advice: just imagine yourself sitting down at that blackjack table in the casino and only spend what you can afford to lose. I hope you found this video helpful, and let me know in the comments if you have any questions or suggestions for future videos. Like and subscribe if you want more in-depth videos like this on the business side of self-publishing.